That kings should philosophize, or philosophers become kings, is not to be expected, but neither is it to be desired, for the possession of power is inevitably fatal to the free exercise of reason. But it is absolutely indispensable for their enlightenment as to the full significance of their vocations, that both kings and sovereign nations, which rule themselves in accordance with laws of equality, should not allow the class of philosophers to disappear, nor forbid the expression of their opinions, but should allow them to speak openly. And since this class of men, by their very nature, are incapable of instigating rebellion or forming unions for purposes of political agitation, they should not be suspected of propagandism. Immanuel Kant. To Kant, there is a difference between ruling and governing. I discussed this difference in its own lecture. And to him, the question, how is the state governed, is much more important than the question, who rules the state. So, who rules the state could be a monarch and monarchy, could be a senate and aristocracy, could be the people in democracy. But the form of ruling, or the form of state, as Kant calls it, is just a means to an end, to another purpose. That purpose being the state being governed right. And forms of government, there are two, according to Kant: despotism and republicanism. And I spent my previous lecture explaining these two and their difference. To Kant, this is mainly about the rule of law, about being not subjected to the arbitrary choices of someone. Again, doesn't matter so much if that someone is one person or if it's the majority of the people, but rather being subjected only to reason, only to justice. And I discussed in that previous lecture how to Kant there are three main differences or three main characteristics of the Republic. First, people being free as human beings, by which Kant does not mean what he calls wild freedom, completely unrestricted freedom, because then you would have no state, no laws at all. And that freedom always destroys itself. If you are free even to kill other people, then they are also free to kill you, and you will probably not stay free for long. Now, by this, Kant means there are laws in the Republic that somewhat restrict freedom, but you are only subjected to laws that you could have given to yourself, rational laws. And you can actually understand the rationale behind them and don't just have to follow them because you are forced, because the state is stronger than you and makes you follow the laws, but you at least can potentially follow the laws because you actually understand them to be good laws. So there are laws that restrict freedom only as much as is necessary in order to protect freedom. Second, in the Republic, there is an equality before the law. Everyone is equal, not in the sense that everyone has the same rights, the same privileges or whatever. There can be differences, but those differences must depend on your deeds, not on your birth. You cannot be born a slave or a noble or whatever. Rather, it must be possible to reach the highest position, to become minister or whatever of the state, and it must be possible to reach the lowest position, to earn yourself the highest punishment the state has to give based on your deeds. And everyone as a subject of the state must have equal dependency on the state and its power, by which Kant means that for everyone in the state, there's only one master, one lord, which is the state itself, or the sovereign of the state. But there must not be masters within the state who, on the one hand, are subject to the state, but to whom, on the other hand, others are subjected. So there cannot be a noble class or slaveholder class or whatever. Rather, the lowest beggar must be able to take the highest minister to court. Everyone must be able to force everyone else through the state, through the law, but no one must be forced by another person directly. And then thirdly, the difference between the republic and the despotic state to Kant is that in the former, all people that are independent, which to Kant means that they can live off their own property, whether it's physical property, like a house, a field where they can grow their own crops, or whether it's a non-physical property, like a craft or a science that they learned and that allows them to now do service to others and earn money through that. But they must be able to live off something which is their own property, not off the property of others, and not off just their body and their labor power. Everyone who is independent like that in a republic should be an active citizen, meaning should take part in the law-giving, Kant says. Not necessarily directly, there doesn't need to be a direct democracy, rather Kant supported a system of representation. But the people must at least be represented in the law-giving, and the laws given should always represent not particular wills of an individual, a group, a class, a party, but rather should always represent the will of the whole and be given as if by the whole. So there should be a fraternal unity of the will of the people, of those independent citizens. So that's what makes the republic. Freedom for everyone as a human being, equality before the law, equality of dependence on the state's power, and for the that is for the subjects, and then for the citizens, for those who have independence, fraternal unity in the lawgiving. Or in other words, the slogan of the French Revolution, freedom or liberty, equality, and fraternity. Now, as I said, all this I discussed in way more detail in my previous lecture, but you could now say all of this is fine and good. Maybe this is what would make a republic, maybe this is how the state should be. But what if we do live not in a republic, but in a despotic state, or at least in a somewhat despotic state, because it's not necessarily completely black or white, right? Some states might be more despotic than others, some less so, some might have some republican elements, but still some despotic elements. Like I said, there might have been progress since Kant's time. States nowadays in the West might be less despotic than back then, but they still, according to his definition, are somewhat despotic. Doesn't change by the fact that they are democracies. I already said it's not about a form of rulership, it's about a form of government, and they still are governed not in a fully republican manner, in the way Kant defines republican. So what if your state is at least somewhat despotic? How do you get from there to a republic? that is, of course, the important question, since no state as of yet fully qualifies as a republic in Kant's sense. And especially in his own days, of course, the 18th century and the time of the French Revolution, also, it was an important question. What to do about these absolute monarchies we had in Europe? What to do about despotism? And here, of course, if you want to improve the state from a despotic one and turn it into a republican one, there are only two possible ways. Either through a sharp change and turn, that is through a revolution, or through a slow transformation, that is through reform step by step. And Kant favors the latter. If possible, he would have preferred to avoid revolutions. Now, his relationship to revolutions is complicated and ambivalent. He fears the price and blood you have to pay for things eventually becoming better. He also considers a revolution to be necessarily and by definition unjust, even if it is a revolution against a despotic government. On the other hand, he did support actual revolutions. He was very enthusiastic about the French Revolution, so it's a bit complicated, which is why I want to talk about this in its own lecture. The next lecture I will discuss what Kant had to say about revolutions. For here, it's enough to say once again that he preferred not having a revolution. If possible, he would rather have the state slowly be reformed. So the despotic government over time should make itself less despotic and more republican. But this, of course, leads to the question, how is that possible? How could that come about? And there, Kant says basically only one thing is needed. And that is that he wants the government to listen to the philosophers. So the philosophers should, in a way, serve as the advisors of the government or of the ruler. And if he listens to their advice, then surely he will step by step reform the state to become more just. Now, here it's important to understand what Kant means by the word philosopher. And I would recommend you, if you haven't already, to check out my earlier lecture on what is wisdom to Kant. Because to Kant, the word philosopher can be defined in two ways. There is what he calls the school concept and the world concept of philosophy. According to the school concept, the philosopher is one kind of scholar, one kind of intellectual, one kind of scientist amongst others. He is chiefly the metaphysician. So he who deals with the supersensual, mainly with the ideas of God, of immortality of the soul, and of freedom. And this is not what Kant means here. So he's not saying the ruler of the state should listen to some professors of philosophy. He's not saying they are what matters. Rather, Kant is here talking about the world concept of philosophy. And according to the world concept, well, philosophy is love for wisdom, right? So the philosopher in this sense is he who loves wisdom, or he who is wise. So he is the sage. And in this world sense, it's not about a profession. So anyone can be a philosopher in the world sense. So Once again, Kant is not talking about specifically professors of philosophy. You could be, I don't know, you could be a baker baking his bread, but at the same time being a wise person, thinking about life, having rational thoughts, and being able to come up with wise ideas about what would be just, how the state should be like, then that would make you a philosopher, not in the school sense, but in the world sense. Um, so that's important to me. This is not about some sort of elitism, saying that there should be an elite of philosophy professors that the state listens to, but rather potentially anyone could be a philosopher if he just happens to be wise. Now, what does it mean to be wise? What is wisdom? Again, for more detail, check out my earlier lecture on what is wisdom. But in short, Kant would say that wisdom is about understanding the highest purpose of humanity, and being being focused on that purpose. So to him, regular scientists, including the philosophers in the school sense, are merely what he calls artists or technicians of reason. Meaning, sure, they are rational, they use their reason, but they use it as a sort of technique to reach any possible random goal that they might set themselves, or that someone else, like the government, might set for them. So a scientist who is a technician of reason could use his science to create a poison, to create a weapon for war. He may use his science to build a nuclear bomb. So if the government tells him, our purpose is we want to fight a war, to win a war, we want to be able to kill lots of people, then he asks his reason, how can we go about that? And he may come up with, once again, the nuclear bomb. But this might be very skillful, maybe in some cases prudent, but it is not wise. Because wisdom would not be to just ask, how can I reach that particular purpose, whatever it may be, but rather wisdom would be to use reason not just as a means to an end, but to use reason to ask, should this even be my purpose? Or rather, should something else be my purpose? What should I make my goal that I try to reach? And this is precisely what the philosopher in the world sense does, which is why Kant calls him not just a technician of reason, but rather the lawgiver of reason. Right? The philosopher in this sense is he who says what ought to be done, what should happen. So he, in a sense, gives a law. He can tell himself and everyone else, this is what we should do. This is what reason dictates for us. This is what would be rational to do. For example, it would be rational to not fight wars, but rather to attain world peace. And so, from that definition that I already gave in the lecture on what is wisdom, the philosopher in the world sense, the sage, whose wisdom means being focused on the final purpose of humanity, him being the lawgiver of reason, from that very definition, it follows that it only makes sense to say this person precisely should be listened to when it comes to the state. This person should tell the government what to do, right? because that too is part of the law giving of reason. That too is part of wisdom. If he is so wise, if he uses his reason to understand what should happen, then he can talk about what would be just, and what a state should do to attain justice, no matter in which specific question. So he could talk about the outer relations of the state, the relations to other states. There he could say, okay, we should attain perpetual peace. How can we go about that? How can we reach world peace? Or be it the inner relations of the state, where he might think about how to attain justice within the state, what to do with criminals, what would be a good system of punishments, or what to do about the economy, what to do about social issues, how to attain social justice. This thinking about this, coming up with a proper rational idea of justice, this is precisely what the philosopher in the world sense does. Or you could say it the other way around: if anyone does this, then that precisely makes him a philosopher in the world sense, even once again if otherwise by profession he's a baker or whatever. So Kant is saying the state should, the ruler should listen to these sages and step by step reform the state according to their advice. This is, of course, in contrast to what in the history of philosophy some others have said. Most prominently Plato, who wanted to make the philosophers the rulers, right? With Plato, famously, we have this concept of the philosopher king. And it is important to point out that Kant does not dream the dream of the philosopher king. Rather, to him, that dream would actually be a nightmare. He's very clear that the philosophers should not be the rulers of the state. The rulers of the state should listen to the philosophers, they should take their advice, but the philosophers should not be the rulers themselves. And here, of course, you could ask the question, why? I mean, if we agree that the philosophers are the lawgivers of reason, that they are wise, that they understand what ought to be done, and that therefore the state should function according to what they suggest, why not simply make them the rulers? Why just have them be advisors to the rulers? Well, and here, when it comes to Kant, we can give two answers. The first answer is simply from Kant's own personality. So if you just look at the kind of person Kant was, already by nature, right? I should point out, I've already said it in earlier lectures, like the lecture on character, that what we call personality or character nowadays, Kant differentiates two types. In German, he calls it the Sinnesart, the mode of sense, and die Denkungsart, the mode of thinking. Sinnesart, mode of sense, is what nature makes of you. So maybe you have by nature this kind of temperament or this kind of temperament. And then on the other hand, the Denkungsart, the mode of thinking, that is what Kant actually calls character. That is what you make of yourself. That is the principles, the maxims that you make yours, that you decide to live by because you have understood them to be good. And here I'm not even so much talking about Kant's character, so about the latter, about the mode of thinking. Um, Rather, I'm more talking about the kind of person he was, even by his nature, even by his innate temperament. By this nature of his, Kant preferred a quiet life. All he really wanted was to, as a professor, teach young men and do his part in helping shaping them into decent, useful, somewhat aufklärt members of society. Um, Otherwise, spent his days meeting his friends, his acquaintances daily, to dine with them, to have witty conversations with them about topics that interested him, mainly different cultures or natural science or whatever. And otherwise, spent his time reading, meditating, writing. He had no ambitions past that. Mm, Even, and I talked about this in the lecture on Kant's life, on his biography, even when he was offered a position in Halle, at the university there, which was another Prussian city that was more central than his city of Königsberg. The university was larger, had a great reputation, so he could have had a wider influence on students there. He would have been a bit more central. He could more easily have been the head of a school of sort there. He refused. He rather wanted to stay in a somewhat more provincial Königsberg. So Kant absolutely had no desire for ruling. There was this rumor going around for a brief time in the 1790s that the French Revolution had invited Kant to come to France and to, with his wisdom, be their lawgiver. Of course, the rumor was completely unfounded. They had never planned to do such a thing in France. But even if they had invited Kant, it's absolutely certain that he would not have taken that invitation. And not only did he not want to be a ruler in a political sense, even when it comes to his scholarly endeavors, um, Kant never, he almost never engaged in polemics and polemical fights with other scholars. He was quite content to publish his works and then just let them stand for themselves. He himself would turn to the next work, to writing something else, and would, for the most part, assume that with time the truth would prevail. With time, if what he had written was correct, then people would start to understand and to believe it. So he didn't spend so much time defending his thoughts against attacks. Um, some of his students, some of the Kantians of the day might have done that, might have engaged in polemics with the opponents of Kantianism, but he himself barely did that. And this is in sharp contrast to other thinkers. I mean, you just have to contrast Kant with Fichte, for example, who very much wanted to influence his listeners, his students, to um, inspire them with his fiery rhetoric, to really lift them up to viewing the ideas, and who also had a completely different style of writing, who did engage in polemics and literary fights. So it's quite telling that there's one book of Fichte which has the subtitle "Attempt to Force the Reader to Understand." This is a title that is very typically Fichte and that you could never in 1,000 years imagine Kant using. Kant would not have tried to force anyone to understand. So Kant's own nature made him not want to be a ruler, and therefore not want the philosophers, since he was one of them, to be rulers. But then this is not the main explanation. Nowadays there is this trend to explain positions of past philosophers through their biographies, through their personalities, through whatever happened to them in their life. Um, I'm not saying, of course, that they as individuals, that this had no influence on their thinking, on their writing. But still, it would be cheap and not worthy of these philosophers um, to simply reduce all they had to say to mere opinions that can be explained psychologically. No, we should actually engage with their thoughts and with the rational reasons for their thoughts. So, what then is the reason Kant would give for the philosopher not becoming the ruler but only the advisor to the ruler? Well, here I can point you back to my earlier lecture on the conflict of faculties. This is based on the fact that in Kant's day, the universities were organized into four distinct faculties: the three higher faculties of theology, jurisprudence, and medicine, and then the lower faculty of philosophy, which at the time included more or less everything else, so not just metaphysics, logics, ethics, but also natural science or history or literature, as far as they already were being taught at universities. And usually you would first go through the lower faculty, that would be like giving you a general education, and you would finish that becoming a magister artium, so a master of arts. And then you would go on to study in one of the three higher faculties, maybe becoming a doctor of theology, of law, of medicine, and then find work based on that. So the three higher faculties were for making a career, right? For becoming a priest, or for becoming some sort of state official, state bureaucrat, as the people who studied law didn't just become advocates or judges, they also largely became bureaucrats, officials. Or you would become a physician if you studied medicine. And in Kant's thinking, the potential conflict that the three higher faculties, namely the first two, those of theology and jurisprudence, to a lesser degree that of medicine, have with the faculty of philosophy, is very important. Indeed, I would recommend my lecture on that topic, on the conflict of faculties, as one of my most important Kant lectures, because I consider this conflict of faculties a key to understanding Kant's whole philosophy, his whole philosophical project. It helps you understand how Kant understood philosophy, understood what he himself was doing, and why he was doing it in the way he was doing it. And here, when it comes to the question of the rulership of the state, we have one such instance where his thoughts on the conflict of faculties help us better understand what he has to say here. Because one difference between the faculties to him is that the three higher faculties, they are, so to say, part of the state, part of society, because again, they are the, you could say, the career faculties. while as a philosopher, you are somewhat independent. You are somewhat standing outside of it all, being able to have an outside perspective, the perspective of a learned man, of a scholar, but still of someone who doesn't have a specific official position. And therefore, you can be critical. Therefore, you can criticize society. So, a main difference to Kant is that the faculty of philosophy is the only one that is free. The other three are bound. And they are bound in two senses, because they have to serve, but they also have to command. Right? So, serving is clear. They are part of the state, part of the whole apparatus of rulership, you could say, right? The theologians, the priests, back in the day, um, they played an important part in upholding the whole system. They were the local priests, teaching the local people, the common people, and especially in the Protestant states, of which Kant states of Prussia was one, they were very much part of the state apparatus, because here they were not part of a global church that functioned internationally and that had its own head, the Pope, but rather they were part of a church that was specific to that country, and the monarch of that country would at the same time be the head of that church. The students of law, then, as I already said, they would go on to become state officials. And maybe the students of medicine, the physicians, would be the ones least involved, least determined by the state. The other two have to serve a specific ideology, the dogma of your church, or the laws and the constitution of your state, and so you can't freely criticize those. The physician, of course, to a larger degree, has to serve nature, the laws of nature, not something that man made up. But of course, even he is involved with the state, with the state's laws on health, on hygiene. I mean, we have seen that in recent years with the COVID pandemic. And Kant would say that these people, they therefore lack independence. They are not really allowed to fully think for themselves. They can, of course, think. I mean, they have gone to university, they have gotten an education, but they are those technicians of reason I talked about. So they use their reason to reach certain purposes, but the purpose as such is given to them by the state, and they mustn't use their reason to question that purpose. And indeed, this is something that we can also see today. I talked about that in the lecture on the conflict of faculties, that today, maybe this is true more or less for all subjects at university, including the so-called professors of philosophy, that they are part of the system, and therefore they are not really meant to question the system too much, right? If they do, they can get problems. I mean, just consider the last 2 years. Consider Israel. You have professors, of course, within Israel. That's a given, right? Like the famous Israeli historian Ilan Pape was basically driven out of his university at Israel because he was criticizing Israel. He had shown that the Nakba was not just an accident. and he had to leave to rather teach in Britain instead. But also someone like the Israeli-born, now teaching in the US, historian and Holocaust scholar Ras Segal, who um, was supposed to get a job at an American university, and it was basically already set and secure. But then, because of pressure, because he was amongst the very first who accused Israel of genocide, he did not get that job. And likewise, I just have to think back to my time at university. We were given these evaluation sheets at the end of every class, and there were questions like, does the teacher take teaching seriously? Is he there on time, and so on? But there were also questions like, does he use gender neutral language, which is a very important thing in Germany that woke left has been pushing for, and that is very controversial. And let's say you, as a teacher, as a professor, you have good reasons not to use that sort of language. Let's say you don't think, for whatever reasons you have reflected about it, and you don't think this is a good thing that should be done, well, it probably won't be so good if these evaluation sheets keep coming back to the university, always saying, no, he doesn't use that gender neutral language. That will probably get you into a bit of trouble. So, and this sort of thing is one of the reasons I never even attempted to have an academic career, because my freedom as a philosopher is important to me. Because what this will lead to, almost inevitably, is that people don't allow themselves to think freely, to think critically, to question the current system or the current ideology, but rather they will abuse their own reason to justify whatever is the current system. Because, I mean, if you would question it inwardly and criticize it inwardly, but you still don't have the freedom to criticize it outwardly, then you would have to feel bad about what you're doing. You would have to despise yourself as a coward and as a liar, as someone who goes along with something he doesn't believe in. So you might rather, to keep your own conscience quiet, you might rather actually convince yourself to believe in what you are doing, convince yourself that it is right. This is what Hannah Arendt criticized the intellectuals for. This is why after 1933 she didn't want to have anything to do with intellectuals anymore, because she observed how in Germany, when the Nazis rose to power, they immediately, before there was any real pressure from the Nazis themselves, immediately coordinated themselves. They immediately fell into line even before it was expected of them. They, as Arendt put it, came up with things about Hitler. Like they had thoughts about him, and thoughts about how this is good for Germany, how it's not in the Germanic soul, this parliamentary democracy, rather the leader state fits better for Germany, and so on. And they actually believed in it. It's not just that they said this to gain favor, that they were being consciously opportunistic, but rather they were being unconsciously opportunistic, believing their own lies. And this is the problem. This is exactly, once again, they are those technicians of reason, so they can use reason to reach any any random purpose given to them, and they can use reason to justify any purpose. And this is something I myself have often observed, that people in some sort of official position or some sort of position where they are part of an institution and at least in a wider sense part of the state, part of the system, that they do this, that they justify things to themselves. And at the same time, Kant would say that the higher faculties, not only are they ruled, not only do they serve the powers that be, they also themselves are rulers. They also themselves give commands, right? Theologian, the priest, tells people what to believe. He teaches the common people the dogma of his church. The student of law who becomes a state official, who represents the state and the laws, who takes part in politics, in bureaucracy, of course also gives the people commands. And even the physician, of course, who tells people how to live their lives, what would be healthy, what to do with their bodies, what diet to observe, and so on. He also gives the command. And only the representative of the faculty of philosophy is in the position to not have to take orders and also to not be able to give orders to anyone. And this is very important. Fichte would also say that Aufklärung is actually about having the courage to neither be a master nor a servant or a slave. Kant understands very well that sure, if you have to obey, then you are, so to say, chained. You are not free. You cannot think freely. But also, if you have to command, if you are a master of some sort, you also are in a way chained to your own position and to those that you rule over, and you also cannot allow yourself to think freely. He very clearly says that power destroys the ability to judge, the ability to make proper critical judgments. And again, here too, you have to justify to yourself what you are doing. I mean, I just have to think on the instances when I was being cancelled by some institution, which inevitably happens if you are critical and if you represent Aufklärung. So, for example, about 10 years ago, I was teaching critical thinking here at my old school, and there was a local communal election, and the mayor of the district was sending out random letters asking people to vote for her. I got such a letter, and I wrote back explaining why I wouldn't vote for her, and also why students of mine wouldn't vote for her. And as a reaction, she contacted that school where I worked. And mind you, the district's mayor, I mean, the school was in that district, but the district's mayor does not have any direct power over the schools. The schools here are state-run. So they are not part of the commune, they are part of the state level. But still, the school's headmistress kicked me out. And I mean, the headmistress was a very abusive woman anyways, constantly having these fits of rage, screaming at people, making students or even parents cry, bullying her own teachers, being racist. I mean, there are so many stories about her involving other people, not even me. um, you would hardly believe it. um, so she is not really what's important here, but her vice principal, um, who was a guy that liked to think of himself as very friendly, trying to be buddies with his students, um, and at the same time, who was supposed to be an educated person, had a PhD, was this typical Ausklärt, that is entwilighted, humanist, Philistine guy thinking of himself as already being aufklärt. And he fully supported this. Now, if you had asked him randomly, are you for democracy, are you for rule of law and whatever, he would have said yes. And if you had asked him about some random case, let's say in Turkey or China or some other despotic country, of a critical voice being kicked from a school after a phone call from a local mayor, he would have said that's terrible, that's despotic. But here he was fully on board with it. And it was not just that he inwardly was against it, but was too much of a coward to say anything. No, he was able to convince himself that this was right. And this could be noted when I talked to him, and also when students tried to talk, when students voiced their protest. The things he made up, like he said, no, kicking me out was justified because I had spoken in the name of the school, which I had not. I mean, you can read my letter black and white. I even have this thing published on my website. Of course, it's in German, but at no point did I say I'm speaking in the name of the school. But he truly made himself believe that. So he came up with these ways of lying to himself. This is, you can go back to my lecture on why lying is so immoral, why Kant rejects lying, and to my lecture on conscientiousness. Conscientiousness being to Kant about only doing something when you absolutely know for sure that it is right and just. Not doing anything even with the slight possibility that it could be an injustice. And this can be tested according to Kant by asking, would I be willing to bet on this? And how much would I bet? Money, my life, or even my eternal felicity? Would I be willing to stand in front of God and say, if this, what I did here, was wrong, then so be it, throw me into hell, because I'm so convinced that it was right. So a person like that has no conscientiousness. A person like that, in this slight position of power, in this case as a vice principal, he completely lies to himself to justify whatever is happening. Likewise, for a more recent case, just from these past weeks, I was giving some lectures at the Munich People's University. People's University is a very widespread institution here in Germany. More or less every town or city has one or even several. It's this institution for adult education, so people can book classes there on just about anything. Like there are lots of language classes, some IT classes that teach investment, or that teach yoga or whatever. And I was giving lectures on philosophy, and I was supposed to be giving lectures at the Munich People's University on Hannah Arendt. But someone who saw my YouTube videos, having given videos on Arendt's concept of totalitarianism and how it helps us better understand what is happening, also somewhat with Muscovy or with the USA, but mainly with Israel. Someone denounced me there, and I got kicked out. The lectures got cancelled. But they weren't even being open and transparent what this was about. The guy there, and the responsible guy, it's quite interesting. He's very, very similar to that vice principal 10 years ago, even down to how they look. Like, he also has a PhD in one of the humanities, and he also is this outwardly very friendly, humanist, democratic, liberal, ausgeklärt guy, thinking of himself as the good guy, but without any sort of self-honesty, completely ready to lie to himself to justify whatever he's doing, because he would not say, okay, we are canceling you because you are calling out Israel's genocide. He would at first say that I would not be up to their standards, which is funny because the standards at these people's universities, they are laughably low. Like, it would really be an insult if I was not up to their standards, like anyone is up to their standards. I would not be up to their standards because my citations in my YouTube lectures on Hannah Arendt are not clear. So I asked back if he can give me a specific example, if he can point out where I misquoted or whatever, and he didn't. Instead, he came up with something completely different. Now pointing at another lecture of mine that had nothing to do with Hannah Arendt, and saying that in that lecture I was generalizing too much and generalizing professors and devaluing the work of professors, of people in the scientific community, which of course I'm also not doing. So this is about my lecture on current day superficiality, where I actually talk about how people should not superficially have opinions about the climate crisis or the genocide in Israel, but should actually listen to real experts, so to the professors. So it's not possible really to come away from that lecture and think that I'm generally and without differentiating bashing all sorts of professors. It's just not possible. But again, from the way this guy talks or writes, I have no doubt that in that moment he actually believes what he is saying. He is part of this institution. Maybe kicking me out is not even just his choice. Maybe his higher ups have insisted on that. That's very much possible. But now he has to do this, and he has to live with this. So to do this without a bad conscience, he needs to lie to himself and to convince himself that this is justified. And so the whole point of this is that, once again, Kant would say, if you are part of an institution, if you are part of the system, then you cannot think freely and critically. You cannot be a sage, a lawgiver of reason, a philosopher in the world sense. You can at best be a technician of reason, able to use his reason to reach any goal, also the goal of justifying whatever evil things you might be doing. So the great advantage of the philosopher is that he neither has to obey, has to follow orders, nor has to give orders. Because once again, power destroys the ability to judge. And it is for that reason that Kant says the philosophers should not be given any power within the state. The philosophers should always keep a sort of outside position of independent outsiders who can freely look at what is happening, because he wants the philosophers to speak as world citizens, as cosmopolitans. I will soon give a lecture on Kant's concept of cosmopolitanism and patriotism. But to put it simply, the cosmopolitan, the world citizen, to him is he who speaks just as a human being as such, not as part of this state, this institution, this class, this party, this group, or not as himself, this individual with these selfish desires. So he is not a proponent of some particular interests of himself or of his group or whatever, but rather, if someone is speaking as a world citizen, if someone is speaking from a cosmopolitan perspective, then he is just speaking as a human being as such. And he is being a proponent not of particular interests, but of the universal, of the common interest of the whole. And this the philosopher can do and ought to do. And in order for that, he must stay free and independent. So Kant would say to Plato, there cannot be a philosopher king, because the moment you make the philosopher king, the moment you let him sit on the throne, he stops being a philosopher by necessity. So for that reason, Kant says, in order for the state to reform, to become better, to become more just, the philosophers, the wise people, should be heard when they are speaking in a cosmopolitan sense, but they should not themselves take the reins, so to say. So both because of his own nature, but also for actual philosophical reasons, Kant wants the philosopher not to be the sovereign of the state, but he wants the sovereign, be it a monarch, a senate of aristocrats, or be it the people in democracy, he wants the sovereign to listen to the philosophers. However, for this, it is not necessary that the philosophers be employed in official position as, so to say, court advisors. Indeed, for one, this would probably not be good, because once again, it would probably harm their free thinking. I mean, of course, this has been done, this has been tried in antiquity, right? Like Plato trying to be the advisor to the tyrant of Syracuse. And according to legend, this did not go so well. The tyrant was not happy with Plato and his advice, and ended up making Plato a slave and selling him on the slave market, where Plato was then rescued by one of his students who balked him and gave him freedom. Or you have someone like Seneca, being a tutor and an advisor in the Roman Empire to the Emperor Nero, until that emperor sentenced him to death. Well, if you are in an official advisor position, and therefore once again somewhat dependent on the ruler, and to stay in the ruler's good grace, again, that might go against your free judgment, against your free thinking. But also at the same time, Kant says, and this is especially true in an absolute monarchy, which he had in his day, this might somewhat contribute to the ruler losing respect, losing that aura of being the perfect, infallible representative of God on earth, right? And I already talked in my lecture on the separation of powers and on sovereignty, that to Kant it is very important that the sovereign seem to be irreprehensible, seem to be holy, seem to be perfect, so that all errors in the state might come from how his laws, his commandments are executed, but not from him himself. So, for that reason, it might not be good for the sovereign to openly admit, yeah, I'm listening to this philosopher and just doing what he tells me to do. So Kant says there should be another way to make the philosophers advisors of the ruler without officially making them such. Well, and here he says there's a simple way to do so: just end censorship, just establish what nowadays would be called freedom of speech. So Kant calls it the freedom of thinking. Because Kant says basically the philosophers can't shut up. It's already enough to do for the state to do this negative work, like just not prohibiting them from speaking. The state doesn't have to do any positive work. The state doesn't have to actively ask the philosophers to speak and to give advice. If it is just allowed, Kant says, they will publish their works and they will publicly discuss their ideas. And then the ruler can take note of that. He doesn't even has to say so. Like he, when reforming the state, when making new laws that were inspired by the ideas of the philosopher, he doesn't have to say, yeah, I just listened to what that philosopher had to say, I just did what he wrote in that book. He can act as if he came up with it himself. Once again, keeping this aura of perfection, of ruling by God's grace. But if he allows for public discourse, for free thinking, then he can be sure that there will be advice to him in the public by understanding, by wise people, by philosophers in this world sense. And so to Kant, what is important is the freedom to think, especially in matters of religion and in matters of right, of law, in political matters. If these two things are established, because these to Kant are the most important topics when it comes to reform, when it comes to progress, and also at the same time they are the topics that are most likely to be censored. Kant says in other areas it's not so likely that the state would involve itself and try to censor things anyway. But if here we have freedom to think and to criticize, then all is well, basically. And so this is to Kant what makes the main difference between the despotic and the republican state. Nowadays, and I already said previously that we have quite simple, quite superficial political concepts nowadays. Nowadays, we often tend to make a distinction between democracy and dictatorship. And that distinction then just hinges usually on who rules. So if everyone rules, if we have rule of the people, then that's democracy, and then that's good. And if there's only one ruler, then that's a dictatorship, and we are against that. Well, to Kant, you could almost say that the main difference between the republic and the despotic state is the question: can you speak your mind? Can you criticize freely? Or can you not? I already said in previous lectures that to him, Frederick the Great, Frederick II, the Prussian king during a lot of Kant's lifetime, is an aufklärt monarch, and under him, Prussia to Kant was already being governed in a republican manner, and that is thanks to the abolishment of censorship. So Kant is saying that, of course, technically, Frederick the Great is an absolute monarch, so he does have the powers of a despot. He could govern as a despot, but he chooses to not do so, while still ruling as an absolute monarch. So while still demanding obedience from everyone, while still treating everyone as a subject, he at least allows people to think rationally, to have their thoughts, to criticize things as they are, just as long as this does not turn into open revolt, just as long as they still obey even to a law that they criticize. And particularly in matters of religion, all censorship more or less was lifted, and this Kant very much approves of. And this is why in his famous essay on what is Aufklärung, Kant says we do not live in an aufklärt age, that is in an age where everyone already is rational, everyone already can think for themselves, but we live in an age of Aufklärung. We live in the age of Frederick, because since now, for more or less the first time, the censorship, especially on religious matters, has been lifted, while people still have prejudices, while people still cannot think for themselves, at least not everyone. Now at least there's the possibility that in time they will learn to think for themselves. In time they will become more rational and less prejudiced. So that is the main difference to Kant. That is what matters. He's saying that basically in other matters, the state can be as despotic as you can imagine. It can oppress people, it can have unjust laws, as long as there's just this one freedom, the freedom to think, the freedom to criticize, things can get better. Because if you found a new truth about, for example, how the state should be reformed, what would be just, what other laws, what changes there should be, and you can openly state it, then it can spread. Others can take it up. And either the ruler can take up the new truth himself, or the educators of the rulers can do so, right? Because the new ruler, and this again doesn't matter much what form of rulership you have. So of course in a monarchy the new ruler will be the prince, and in democracy it will be everyone, all the children that are sent to school. But whoever is going to be the next rulers, they will have to be educated, and their teachers, of course, will probably be educated people that studied at university. So they will probably have absorbed some of the ideas in public discourse. So if there can be a free public discourse, that then in time there can be progress, and If this ruler won't reform the state, then maybe the next one, who already has been educated with new ideas, um, will take up some of those ideas and will push for some reforms. And then again, there will once again be new ideas, and maybe the next ruler after him will again push for more reforms. And so in time, things can get better. So Kant would probably go so far as to say that you should rather live in a more despotic, more unjust state with freedom of thought than in a less despotic state where you have no freedom of thought. Because no matter how small the problems in the latter may be, as long as there are problems, as long as it's not absolutely perfect, you would want to reform that state, but you can't if there's no freedom to think. While no matter how huge the problems, the injustices in the former state may be, as long as there is the possibility to criticize them, then they can be changed, and eventually that former state will probably surpass the latter. The latter will stagnate on the level it already has attained, and the former will continue becoming more just. So I think this is something that we can observe, right? Just look at the history throughout the last decades, throughout the last century or more, of oppressed groups in Western states, be it black people and the civil rights movement, be it women and the women's movement, the suffragette movement, be it homosexual people and their movement, the gay movement. You will always find that, yes, there was despotism, there was injustice in the state. And not only there was, I mean, there still is, right? I'm not saying that everything is perfect now, which is, of course, why such movements have to continue. Like when you consider black people, for example, sure, there's not a level of segregation that there used to be. But still, there are large issues, which is, right, like police violence, which is why you had something like the Black Lives Matter movement. But again, we can be hopeful, just like these movements in the past were successful, pushing for more justice. We can be hopeful that in the present they will also, even if it might take a while, and even if that might be frustrating, and even if that, of course, might not be too helpful for the people suffering right now from right now's injustices, we can at least be hopeful that in time things will continue to get better. As long as people have the freedom to criticize, as long as such movements are possible at all, then they can push for change. So let's consider, for example, gay rights. Here in Germany, even past World War II, engaging in homosexual acts, having gay sex was illegal. It only became legalized in the 70s. And even then, of course, gay people were not equal. It took much longer, up until like 10 years ago, till marriage for all became a thing. Now, compare that to current day Muscovy. Their gay sex as such is not illegal. So in private, you can do more or less what you want. But of course, gay people are being very much oppressed. There are these laws against so-called homosexual propaganda. So they can hardly be openly gay. They can not have gay pride marches or whatever. Um, so if you just compare the level of injustice, you would have to say that Germany in the first decades of the Federal Republic was more despotic towards gay people than current day Muscovy. Because over there, it's just the open expression of homosexuality that can get you into prison. While here, back then, it is the actual act of engaging in homosexuality that got you into prison. But the difference is that over there in Muscovy, you have no freedom of speech, no freedom of thinking. While here, even in the 60s, in the 50s, when doing homosexual acts was still illegal, at least talking about it and demanding for it to be legalized was legal. And so, with Kant, we could say that all in all, while back then you would have been more oppressed as a homosexual person in Germany than you are now, maybe in Muscovy, all in all, it's still better for gay people here, and even was back then, because here at least they have this possibility to improve their condition, which over there they do not. And therefore, what really matters to Kant is exactly this freedom to criticize. If that exists, then the philosopher in the world sense can speak openly. And again, it's not a philosopher in the school sense that Kant is talking about, not a professor necessarily, it could be anyone. So I would say that nowadays there's hardly any person in the global public who is more a philosopher, a sage, a lawgiver of reason in this sense of Kant than Greta Thunberg, who, of course, is not a professor of philosophy, has not studied this subject, um, but who is someone who uses her own reason to think about what would be just, how things should be, and who can stand in the public and say, well, we should live sustainably. We should protect the climate and not destroy our own way of life. Particularly when it first hurts not ourselves, but people in other countries and countries that are poorer, that are being exploited anyways. Or who stands in the public and can say we should not support apartheid and imperialism and genocide. And here again, the point is that as long as this is possible, as long as this freedom exists, then no matter how much everything else sucks, I mean, our states destroying the climate or our states supporting the genocide in Palestine, there can at least be hope for improvement, for people pushing for eventual change. And I mean, we can already see this happening, right? Like with the Palestine movement, there have been changes in public opinion. Now, unfortunately, it takes time for this to have a bigger influence on politics. Unfortunately, the politicians in many Western countries, particularly here where I am in Germany, they are still very much pro genocide and pro war crimes and pro apartheid. But still, with how things are going and how public opinion is changing, you can foresee that in the coming decades this might change. That especially with the younger generation, as that generation will gain more political influence as voters, but also as politicians that will come out of that generation, um, it is very likely that Western countries will move further away from Israel and will stop supporting Israel as much. So, as long as you have this freedom to criticize, then things can get better. So, once again, it's better for things to be more unjust at the moment, but with the possibility of improvement because there's freedom to speak, rather than things being relatively more just, but with no freedom of thinking and therefore no room for improvement. And this is also, I think, the one thing that Western states have going for themselves, right? I want to point out that there is this cynicism um, that has existed for a while, but that has grown particularly strong the past 2 years during Israel's genocide. A cynicism about the Western states, the Western democracies, that is strong in parts of the global South, but also strong within the West amongst certain leftists. And these cynical people will basically say, oh, the West is just being hypocritical. The West may talk a great deal of democracy and human rights and rules based world order. Um, but at the end of the day, if you look at their actual actions, um, then the US or NATO or the EU aren't really much better than China or Moscow or whatever. They too only think of themselves and not of human rights. They too engage in blatant imperialism. They too conquer and exploit and murder and genocide. They too are very ready to simply break international law and simply ignore it or actively work against it, right? Um, Putting sanctions on UN rapporteurs or on judges at the International Criminal Court if it serves their interest. And also inwardly, these states, they too, just like others, are run by despotism, by bureaucracy, by self-interest, by class interests. They too, for all the talk of democracy, are just serving the ruling, the wealthy classes. There's this whole cynicism going on. And I would say about all those things, they do have a point for sure. I mean, um, the the auscleared liberal people with their ideology that supports the Western societies as they are and their politics, they would be enraged about such cynicism. They would say, "Oh, this is not true," and you mustn't engage in this relativism. You cannot put the US or the EU on one level with Moscow or China. But then maybe ask the people in Palestine if they really feel so much better than the people in Ukraine or the people in Xinjiang or whatever. So there is a point to that cynicism. But still, I would stress that we should not become cynical and we should not engage in relativism too much. We should also keep an open eye for the differences that there are. And I think the main difference is not what the ideologues of the Western societies would point us at, saying, oh, but we have human rights, we have democracy, and so on. Fuck that. But the one important difference that there indeed is that there's a greater level of freedom of thinking. That you can talk publicly and criticize publicly, you can demonstrate, and therefore, um, as much injustice as there might be, you can at least push for things to become better, right? It's not like Muscovy where you get imprisoned simply for just using the word war, not even criticizing the war, just calling a war, and not a special military operation that goes on for years. Or like China, where you might get imprisoned simply for holding up an empty blank sheet of paper. Um, so here we should not be cynical. Here, this is the one thing I think that Western states really have going for themselves, this possibility to criticize and therefore to improve. However, this makes it all the more important to make sure that we retain and that we expand this possibility, this right. Because, of course, the freedom of thinking is also being threatened in Western states, particularly in the last years, and especially when it comes to Palestine. There was a great push, of course, for um, also abolishing the freedom of thinking here, which again makes the aforementioned cynicism more and more justified, which makes us come closer and closer to such states as Moscow or China, because suddenly here too, just like in Moscow you get imprisoned just for saying war, here in Germany suddenly you get imprisoned just for saying genocide. I mean, here people on demonstrations, they have gotten in trouble just for saying from the river to the sea. Um, or someone has gotten in trouble just because he posted online, Mr. Netanyahu, are you not feeling ashamed for doing the same things that the Nazis did to your people? Now, whatever you think about that, surely that person should not be sued for just this post for relativization or denial of the Holocaust. So clearly we have an issue here too, and it is very important to fight for that. It is very important to hold up the right to criticize, to openly talk about injustices, and to openly talk about what would be more just. Because once again, as long as we have that right, no matter how unjust the state is, there's the possibility that over time it will improve. But if we don't have that right to criticize and to spread our ideas of justice, to openly speak as philosophers, and to not just speak as people that are part of the system and whose speech just supports the system, then no matter how relatively just the state is, there is no hope for improving it and making it even more just. Now, I do want to stress in all of this that we should not be so superficial as to simply understand Kant as being a supporter of free speech as it is understood nowadays. There's this tendency when dealing with past thinkers, with past philosophers, to just ask, have they agreed with or were they supporters of what we have now, democracy, free speech, and so on. And if they didn't agree with that, then they just get dismissed. Then people just say, oh, they're against democracy, they were against free speech, so they were wrong, they are not worth reading and considering anymore. But on the other hand, if they seem to agree, they are also dismissed. So in a more positive way, then people will say, oh great, they were ahead of their time, that they were so aufklärt, so enlightened, because back then they were already thinking just what we are thinking today. But since we have it today, there's nothing else we can learn from them. Well, I would suggest going a bit more in depth and looking more closely at what these past thinkers actually had to say, in this case Kant. I already said that before when it came to Kant's republicanism, that we should not be so superficial as to simply say, oh, Kant was already criticizing the absolute monarchies of his day, he wanted democracy, so nowadays he would be happy. No, if we look more closely, we can say that nowadays he would still have things to criticize. He didn't just want the technicality of not having one despot, but everyone being part of the despot, everyone being able to vote so that the majority can push for its self-interest, but rather he wanted a truly rational state, a true rule of law, and there's still stuff we can learn from him here. Because to him it was more about the posture of those ruling and governing the state, and not just about the mere constitutional system. And likewise here, when it comes to free thinking, I think we also can still learn something from Kant. It's not just that we can say, oh, Kant wanted free speech, we have free speech now, so that's great. Because nowadays, I mean, everyone is for free speech, just like everyone's for democracy, because you learn in school that, oh, this is very important, great that we have it, you need to support it. But if you ask people why should there be free speech, maybe they couldn't give a good reason. I mean, let's be heretics for a moment and actually ask, why is it good that any lie or any stupidity can freely be spread? Why should there be free speech for fake news and conspiracy theories and alternative facts? Why would it be a good thing that completely unqualified people can simply state publicly, no, the earth is flat, or no, there is no climate emergency, or no, there is no genocide in Gaza? Why would these lies be allowed? The issue is that nowadays free speech is often treated as an end in itself, especially by those who talk most loudly about it, because nowadays it's mostly the right-wingers who will talk about free speech, right? Even being fanatics of free speech, at least until they get in power, then suddenly it turns out that they are not for completely unrestricted free speech, but only for their own. But yeah, it is those Trumps or those Musks of the world that will talk about free speech the most, and about free speech being censored. And they especially treat it as if it was a good in itself. And that is unaufklärt. Because, as I've already mentioned several times, and when I get to Kant's concept of Aufklärung, I will get back to it. Aufklärung to Kant means freeing yourself from delusion. But delusion, in turn, to him means treating a means to some purpose as a purpose in itself. So the greedy and miserly person treats money not as a means to buy things with. I mean, it's one thing if you want to be wealthy in order to buy lots of stuff for yourself, but rather he treats money as a purpose in itself. Wealthy not for being able to buy stuff, but just for being wealthy. And he is even living like a poor person, eating simple meals, wearing simple clothes, and so on, just to save money. But why does he need to save money if he is just saving it, if he never spends it anyways? So that is delusional and therefore unaufklärt. And this we have when it comes to free speech. People are delusional about it. Those right-wingers are delusional about it because they don't ask, okay, what is it a means for? It should be a means for the purpose of improving the state, of attaining more justice, or more generally, of people becoming more aufklärt. But to them, it's not a means to an end, it's an end in itself. To them, it's good to just have free speech. And so, especially from Americans, we hear in Europe or in Germany, we will hear stuff like, oh, you don't have free speech because you're not allowed to deny the Holocaust. Well, the Holocaust happened and it was a terrible crime. So how is it so terrible that we are not allowed to deny it? Why do you want to deny it so badly? So instead of thinking of Kant as simply someone who advocated for what we have nowadays, we should see the subtle differences. Kant was not for free speech for everyone, but just for one particular group. That is the philosophers. Now, of course, in practice, that means that legally you have free speech for everyone. Because again, by philosophers, Kant does not mean the professors or whatever. Rather, Kant means everyone who will speak as a philosopher, everyone who is wise, everyone who has something to say about truth and justice. And since you cannot decide beforehand who that is gonna be, legally you have to give free speech to everyone. But it is meant for the philosopher. So you can say that to Kant, free speech is for two things. It's for science, for the advancement of science. So scholars, scientists, experts, they should be free to think and to speak. And it is for what the ancient Greeks called paresia, which means, literally it means all speaking, so being frank, holding nothing back. But usually it is described, at least since Foucault, as speaking truth to power. So the paresiastes is him who dares to, who has the courage to openly criticize the powerful, to hold nothing back, but to say things as it is. Once again, I don't know any better modern example for this than Greta Thunberg, whose very motto has always been, tell it like it is. And this, the advancement of science and engaging in paresia, speaking truth to power, this is what Kant wants to have free speech for. So you could say, as not only I do, for example, the historian Timothy Snyder says, we should remember that free speech is not for powerful people like the president or for billionaires. Free speech is not meant for the Trumps and Musks of the world. I mean, they have power to do what they want anyways. They don't need free speech. We need free speech. Free speech is for the little guy. Free speech is precisely so that we can criticize the Trumps and the Musks of this world and don't immediately get locked up for that. So, in that sense, you could say that Kant wants freedom of speech so that the philosophers can talk. And once again, they are those people who don't talk as themselves, as these individuals with these self-interests. They don't represent either their own interest or the interest of their party, of their class, of their group, their tribe, or whatever. but rather they speak as world citizens, as cosmopolitans. They represent the interest of humanity as such. And this is what you should do. This is your responsibility. Uh, the only voice that should be heard in public is not the voice of this or that individual, but it is the voice of reason, which is the very reason why this channel is called that way, because that's what I try to do here, not to speak my opinions, my own personal opinions, but rather to be a mouthpiece for reason as such, to speak the truth. Just like when you say 1 plus 1 is 2, you're not speaking your opinion, you are letting reason speak through yourself, and it would speak just the same way through anyone else who is talking rationally about mathematics. Once again, I want to stress that when we say with Kant that not everyone has a right to speak in public, then here right is meant in a moral sense, not in a legal sense. Of course, legally, neither Kant nor I are for a restriction of free speech by the state. The state should not make a law saying only rational people have a right to speak. Because, I mean, if you let the state decide who is and who isn't rational, then essentially that means that there is no right for free speech, for freely criticizing the state. But rather the state would, of course, only allow those to speak who will speak in its favor. And also, if we assumed that the state, or the representatives of the state, that the rulers, are rational enough to always judge correctly which speech is rational and therefore should be allowed and which isn't, then they might also they might just as well forbid all speech, because if they are rational enough to always judge this, then they don't need rational advice from the philosophers. Then they don't need to be criticized, because then they will already rule in a rational manner. So, of course, both Kant and me would say that legally everyone should have the right to speak. But morally, not everyone has. So once again, just as I said in a previous lecture with the issue of democracy and republic, the difference between Kant's position and what we have nowadays is not so much a difference on the legal front, it's a difference in posture. Kant wants a certain posture from those in power. He wants them to be aufklärt, to be rational, to not just serve their self-interest. That would be despotic of them, even if it's not one despot, but the whole people is the despot. And the same can be said here when it comes to free speech. The difference is in posture. So the state should allow anyone to talk, but not every person should allow himself to talk. Rather, you should be very self-critical and ask yourself, do I really have something to say? Do I really have a moral right to speak? You should consider speaking publicly as a responsibility and take it seriously, and should ask yourself, is reason speaking through me here? Or is it only my self-interest, my own prejudices, my own sympathies and ideologies and loyalties that are speaking here? Only if you are the voice of reason, only, once again, here conscientiousness is so important. So only if you could dare to stand in front of God and say, I'm so sure that what I have said was true and good and just, that if it wasn't, you may throw me into hell, only then should you allow yourself to speak. Because that, speaking truth, advancing science, speaking truth to power, engaging in Parisie, furthering Aufklärung, in other words, being a philosopher in the world sense, being a sage, that is what the freedom to speak, which to Kant is Once again, he doesn't say freedom to speak, he says freedom to think. That is what it is for. That is why he supported it. So Kant would say, sure, there's despotism if the state with its laws outright forbids you from speaking your mind. But just because it is allowed, that alone doesn't yet guarantee that there is no despotism. Because at the end of the day, the ruler, be he a single king, be he a senate, or be he the people as such, the ruler is a despot if he rules according to his own whims, if his rulership is arbitrary and self-serving, and if he does not listen to what the wise people, through whom reasons speak, have to say. And here it doesn't matter much if he is being despotic and doesn't listen to the sages because he forbids them from speaking, or if he technically, formally allows them to speak, but then simply ignores them or even makes fun of what they have to say. Because, sure, it is a problem if what is rational is not allowed to be said, but it is also a problem if what is rational is technically allowed to be said, but the irrational is also being said and is being said so much louder that it drones out the rational things being said. And here at the end of this lecture, I'm done talking about what Kant has to say, but I want to add to this one remark of my own. And that is anti-Aufklärung. Darkening, we could call it, right? The opposite of Aufklärung, of enlightening, is darkening. Anti-Aufklärung can work in different ways. One way we could call, with a name that was used in Kant's time in the 18th century, obscurantism. That way is the classical, it's the open, it's the honest way. It works through censorship. So you just forbid people from speaking their mind, from trying to aufklären others, and maybe if they do, then you execute them, you burn them at the stake or whatever. Now, this obscurantism still very much is a thing in large parts of the world, in Moscow, in China, in Saudi Arabia, where if you criticize the state, you might find yourself end up being murdered and cut into pieces in the embassy in Turkey. But we should not think that this obscurantism is not also a thing in Western democracies. Maybe not quite to the same degree, but it also exists here. And it is having a sort of comeback, especially in the last few years. Once again, especially the issue of Palestine was used to push for a new obscurantism. Here in Germany, like I said, I myself have been cancelled recently from the Munich People's University for speaking out. And there have been much bigger cases, like a planned Palestine Congress that was cancelled by the police, and people being banned even from coming to Germany, from speaking in Germany. So obscurantism still is very much a thing. But it is not the only method that darkening has. Another method is used by what I call Ausklärung or Entwilightment, so the pseudo-Aufklärung. And this one is more subtle and in a way much more terrible, because again, this Ausklärung ist die Pseudo-Aufklärung, so it pretends to be the Aufklärung and it pretends to not be engaged in anti-Aufklärung, but rather in fighting anti-Aufklärung. Well, and the method of this Ausklärung is it allows for everyone to speak. But since everyone is allowed to speak, of course, not just rational things are being spoken, but also irrational things. And the rational things that should be listened to might drown in the sea of irrationality. I mean, just take me and this channel here, for example. Sure, I'm allowed to speak. There's no legal prohibition. But then there are so many other people here alone on YouTube speaking, and so many, of course, not all, there are also good channels, but so many of them are speaking utter bullshit, and getting much, much more clicks, of course, getting much, much more attention. And the algorithm might not even show what I have to say or what other rational people have to say to many people. And so die Ausklärung lets the aufklärt, the rational speech be, but it is drowned out by the unaufklärt, by the irrational speech. And also the Ausklärung engages in this constant relativism, saying there is no truth, and if you believe to have the truth, then, or there is no justice, there is no good and evil, and if you believe to be good and just, then you are at best arrogant and full of yourself, and should learn some humility. I mean, if you ask me, there's nothing more humble than saying, I'm not saying my opinion, I'm being the voice of reason. I mean, the truly arrogant thing is saying, what I have to say is just my personal opinion, it's not the truth, it's not better than anyone else's opinion, and still I dare to say it publicly. Still, I want people to listen to it. Still, I annoy people with this. Instead of taking a seat and stepping back and leaving the stage to those who actually have a truth, who actually do speak not as themselves but as the voice of reason. That is the arrogant thing. But die Ausklärung will claim that the rational person, the good person, is at best arrogant. At worst, he's being dangerous, he's being totalitarian. Like, I have heard such accusations. I've heard Greta Thunberg being accused of such a thing, right? For saying that, well, listen to the science. I have heard the accusation from ausklärt journalists, and there's almost no class in society that is more ausklärt than the journalistic class. Oh, she's undemocratic by saying, listen to the science. Democracy is about compromise and about patience and so on. And yeah, but nature is not. Nature doesn't care about that. This is physics. If we continue with the emissions, then the earth continues to heat. And with all the problems that brings, droughts and natural catastrophes and so on. And nature doesn't care for the democratic process. But these people, they will then say, oh, she should not treat her opinion as absolute truth by saying, listen to the science. Well, it is the truth. And if you deny that, then you are a science denier, which these ausklärt people would never admit to being, because, again, they pretend to be aufklärt. They like to pretend to be the rational people. But this is the tactic of Ausklärung. It lets everyone speak, but it treats the rational speech as just as good and not better as the irrational speech. And if it wants to be more, if it insists on being rational and true, it gets attacked, it gets mocked, it gets relativized, and so on. And thirdly, there's of course also fascism, which also has its own tactic of darkening. You might assume that fascism would just engage in obscurantism, would just engage in censorship and persecution of those who have something true and just and good to say. And to be sure, historically, fascist states have done so, but I would say that was an inconsistency. That was just them not being fully fascist. That was just them retaining elements of simple despotism and obscurantism. Because what actual fascism wants is what the Nazis called Gleichschaltung, coordination or synchronization, making everyone the same. Now, what that means precisely depends on the specific fascism and the specific ideology. Like, for some, it might mean everyone should be a blonde, blue-eyed Aryan. For others, it might mean everyone should belong to a specific faith and not be an infidel. And again, what faith that is depends on whom you are asking, right? So there are fascists of all kinds of fundamentalist faiths. Um, but the common thread for all fascisms is that they want everyone to be the same. And if they could ever reach their goal, so if you envision the fully fascist society, which of course could never in actual real life be fully realized, you could get closer and closer to it, but you could not fully achieve it. But if you imagine it as being achieved, everyone being the absolute same, everyone marching in perfect lockstep, everyone having completely ceased to be an individual and become part of the collective, humanity stopping to be human and just becoming a colony of ants, and just the way we imagine ants, actual ants, if you listen to actual behavioral biologists and so on, actually have more individuality than fascists want people to have. Then, if you achieve that, you could even allow for freedom of speech, because every talk would not be a dialogue, but just like talking to yourself, because everyone else would think the exact same thing as you do. So there's nothing that could be learned. There would be no new ideas, no originality, nothing critical being said. So those obscurantism that simply denies the right to talk, Ausklärung that actually emphasizes the right to talk, but says that everything being talked about, everything being said is equal. And with this relativism, makes it impossible for actual rational things that are being said to have an effect, to actually inspire people and teach people. Or fascism that wants to make everyone the same, so that nothing new could be said anyways. All of them are engaged in their own ways in preventing Aufklärung, preventing progress, and so all of them are a problem. But nowadays, in modern Western societies, it is mainly, not exclusively, but mainly the Ausklärung that we are dealing with. Again, there are elements of obscurantism, and maybe obscurantism and fascism might be on the rise. And maybe they might be on the rise precisely because Ausklärung paved the way for them. Not consciously, not wanting that. The Ausgleich people would always say they are against despotism, they are against fascism. But still, with their relativism, they make the rise of fascism possible. But at least for the time being, Ausklärung is the main form of darkening that we are dealing with. And here I want to say that always in history, in every society, there have been these people that with Kant we can call philosophers in the world sense. There have been these sages, these outsiders who dared to engage in parrhesia and telling truth to power, these people who have been critical, prophets, you could say, since the Quran defines the prophet basically as a warner, saying God will not destroy any people, any society, without first having warned them through a prophet that he sent to them. And if you turn to myth, if you turn to, let's say, the Bible, the Old Testament, you will have stories of both people listening and people not listening, right? Like you have the story of Jonah being sent to the city of Nineveh, warning them that God is going to destroy them because of their evil ways. But they listen, they repent, they change their ways, and they are not destroyed. But then on the other hand, you have a story like that of Moses, who is sent to Egypt, to the Pharaoh, telling him, "Let my people go. What you are doing, enslaving these people, is evil." And the Pharaoh does not listen. His heart is hardened. And through his refusal to listen to the prophet, to listen to the warner, he brings over Egypt 10 plagues. And eventually he brings his own demise. And throughout history, you can see that for the longest time, these sages, these prophets, these philosophers, these critics, these people engaged as in parousia, for the longest time, they were mostly attacked by obscurantism, right? Jesus being crucified, Muhammad being driven out of Mecca, or the philosophers, right? Socrates in Athens being made to drink poison, later Spinoza being excommunicated basically from his community, his Mosian community, even being attacked on the street with an attempt on his life, an attempt to stab him. Giordano Bruno being burned on the stake, just like Vanini. And even in somewhat more recent times, Kant, I talked about this in the lecture on his life, getting into trouble with the censorship in Prussia because of his works on religion. So this was after Frederick the Great. This was under the new king, Frederick Wilhelm II, who engaged in obscurantism again. Fichte, in the course of the atheism dispute, being driven out of Jena, of his professorship there. And even more recently, you have someone like Wilhelm Reich, who was in the 50s, so even after the Second World War, and in the allegedly oh so free United States, was imprisoned and died in prison for his research into cancer therapy, into the organ energy. And I mean, at worst, maybe he was wrong with his scientific theories, but then at worst, what you could say about him is that he was wrong, that he was in error. But he did not want to be wrong. He was not a charlatan. He did not consciously trick anyone or scam anyone. And he was certainly well-meaning, and he was certainly not doing anything dangerous to society, and still he ended up dying in prison. And once again, even I, in this day, in the 21st century, have been cancelled more than once. So sure, no one yet has tried to burn me at the stake or to make me take poison. So you could say there is some progress, but this is only progress of civilization, not of moralization. I will talk about the difference much later when I get to Kant's anthropology. But Kant would say civilization is just about the outer form, about decency, about decorum. but it does not necessarily mean a true morality, a true goodwill. So maybe we have become more civilized, so the obscurantists don't outright kill and execute their victims anymore. But we have not necessarily become more moralized because the obscurantists are still going after critical voices. But then, once again, nowadays, the main problem is not even the obscurantism in Western societies, it's the Ausklärung. Again, think of the greatest prophet of our time, think of Greta Thunberg. She has not been outright forbidden from speaking. Indeed, she was even at first invited to speak in Davos, in New York, in front of the UN. And also, it's not like society is so fascist that it prevented her from even being able to speak. Now, there are fascist elements in society, and this very much affected her. You can read the book Scenes from the Heart that she and her family published years ago already. Certainly, we do live in a society that tries to make itself homogeneous, that tries to kill genius, kill originality, that tries to force children to coordinate, to synchronize them. And that has not much room for people being different, being special. And she suffered for that greatly. She, during her school days, there were times when she was very depressed, times when she would refuse to eat, times when she would refuse to speak to almost anyone. So, yes, she has been affected by the fascist elements in our society too, and only overcome that with her activism once she became more aufklärt and attained that felicity, that inner happiness that every aufklärt person has. But mostly, what has been done is nullifying her effect, her voice, through Ausklärung. As I already said, she can speak, sure, but so can everyone else. The outright climate change deniers and the less honest deniers who will say, yes, there's climate change, we need to do something about it, but we also have to think of the economy. And we also have to make compromises. That's part of the democratic process. And all those people that attacked her as allegedly being against democracy, being totalitarian or whatever, because she believes in good and evil, because she talks about justice. So this is the problem that we are dealing with nowadays. And I will close this by saying that Nietzsche said there must be a new type of philosopher. He himself did not yet consider himself this new philosopher, just doing the preliminary work for that, but he said there would be a new type of philosophy, there would be a philosopher of the future. Well, now it is here. I am one of these new future philosophers. Hopefully, I'm not going to be the last of them. But here in the history of philosophy, an old chapter that has been going on for a long time has come to an end, and the philosophers really have turned the page. But this is not so much what Nietzsche is saying already, but I would add to what he is saying. Philosophers of the future, a new type of philosopher will also require a new type of audience, an audience of the future. People that will for once be willing to listen and to learn and to truly aufklär themselves and to take seriously what the philosopher has to say. If we are judging the level of Aufklärung first by a society's willingness to listen to its prophets, And I mean, this would be the first step only, right? A society being willing to listen and to learn from its prophets. Because, of course, the second step, if the society became more aufklärt, would be the society no longer needing prophets, because everyone would be his own prophet. Everyone would think for himself, would think rationally, so everyone would be a philosopher in the world sense. Everyone would be a sage. But that is something we are still as far away from as ever. In that regard, basically no progress has been made. But even that first step, if you yourself are not rational enough to make your own judgments, then at least you should listen to him who is, and you should learn from that person. So what is required is what Nietzsche calls the instinct for rank. Having an instinct that lets you sense, basically, here is someone with a certain rank. Here is someone who has something important to say. Here is someone who truly stands for goodness and justice and truth. And I should take him seriously. I should learn from him. I should not dismiss what he has to say. As long as we don't even have that in society, as long as society keeps persecuting or dismissing, mocking its sages, its prophets, then no progress has been made. And then this society has no right to think of itself as even slightly more aufklärt, more enlightened than people hundreds or thousands of years ago. So now the world is being tested. The philosophy of the future is already there. It has already been started. The question is there also an audience of the future? And this test might just as well be the last one. If we consider things like the climate, like the ecological crisis, we might not be given another chance. So now it is everyone's responsibility to take part in this project of Aufklärung. And if he is not taking part as leading that project, then that is okay, but then he should take part in at least following that project. So Aufklärung is being offered here by me, but also in another way by, for example, Greta Thunberg, and surely also by some others. And now the question is, has this society taken even one step towards progress? Is it willing to finally recognize when someone has something to say and to take it seriously, to learn from that? Or will it once again end up just burning these people at the stake, or maybe not doing that, but dismissing these people, not taking them seriously, mocking them? If it does that once again, then, as I said, it might have failed one final time, because the ecological catastrophe that is awaiting us may not allow for another chance. So this is everyone's responsibility. But as for Kant, this is what he has to say. Once again, the state, in order to turn it from a more despotic into a more republican state, it doesn't need to be ruled by the philosophers, by the wise people. That would not even be a good thing, because they would stop being philosophers if they were given power. But the state, the ruler of the state, the people, in case of a democratic state, should listen to what they have to say. And in order for that to be possible, it should allow people to say something. It should not engage in censorship, but rather it should allow for free, open, critical, rational discourse. And that way, if that is allowed, there is hope for the state at least slowly improving and becoming more just. But of course, that leaves us with the question of, what if it is not allowed? What if the state is so despotic that even thinking freely, criticizing freely is forbidden. Then there is no hope for reform, and then it would seem that leaves us only with the one choice to violently revolt, to start a revolution. And so what Kant has to say about that is what I want to talk about in my next lecture. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Leo Allmann, Cenk-Kubilay Altu, Thomas Deuringer, Gernot Claufen, Benjamin Lehning, Ökobong, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, Spendierhosenträger, Ron Suhl, as well as to all others who support me and my aufkläring cause.